The Trump administration's opening policy blitzkrieg, on day one alone, 48 presidential actions, a record 24 executive orders, and 78 past executive orders revoked, has touched many different policy areas, but none more powerfully than DEI. Eliminating the divisive and dangerous preferential hierarchy created by, quote, the injection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, into our institutions, was indeed listed as number one of three policy priorities announced on President Trump's first day in office, ahead of immigration reform and combating, quote, climate extremism. The boldness of Trump's anti-DEI initiative is indicated by three actions that have surprised even conservatives who have tracked these issues closely, myself included. First, Trump revoked Executive Order 11246 and other related steps, a move that struck an unprecedented blow against affirmative action and eliminated federal support in place since 1965. Second, he eliminated, not reformed, all federal DEI offices and officers in one fell swoop, something not even red states had ever contemplated. Third, he fired two of the three Democrats who serve as commissioners on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, thereby rendering that supposedly independent body incapable of pushing back against the rest of Trump's anti-DEI efforts for the foreseeable future. The penetrating power of these three measures is matched by the broad scope of the Trump government's anti-DEI efforts. Summarizing it in detail would take up too much space here, but so far, I count 9 executive orders issued since the 20th of January. Of these 9, 4 deal with anti-Semitism and the status of transgender persons. The remaining 5 take aim at DEI in its various registers and in different contexts. 2 others, one related to free speech and another rescinding 78 past executive orders, also make contributions to the anti-DEI cause. Narrower anti-DEI initiatives emanating from individual federal agencies are by now too numerous to count. How effective will Trump's legal assault be? The dominant interpretations of DEI and radical progressive ideology set forth in books today focus on the causal role of bad ideas and other cultural factors. Cultural Marxism, Christopher Rufo, postmodernism, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, or social justice activism manifested as some strange new Puritanism, Andrew Doyle, or other quasi-religious impulse, John McWhorter. If these interpreters are correct then, regardless of how decisive they are, the actions of the Trump administration are superficial and doomed to fail, unless accompanied by some broader intellectual and cultural movement to change Americans' hearts and minds. That latter campaign does not seem to be forthcoming. And to be honest, most of today's anti-DEI activists seem neither equipped nor inclined to do that kind of work. But there is another school of DEI interpretation, advanced by authors like Rick Epstein, R. Shep Melnick, and Christopher Caldwell, that emphasizes the causal power of politics and law. According to this view, DEI is a consequence of the civil rights revolution broadly construed, and of the contours of anti-discrimination law in its particulars. If this account of things is correct, we have every reason to think that the Trump administration's actions are going to change the landscape of democratic life for the long haul. Much is at stake in this question. Populist frustration has put its finger on real problems. The term wokeness identifies our hypersensitive, invasive, censorious, punitive, and pedantically moralizing social and political order, a scheme that divides groups against one another in the name of social justice. Its questionableness is signaled by the many ways it breaks with our liberal democratic constitutional tradition. It champions the identities of groups, not the rights of individuals. It obliterates the boundary between public and private. It harnesses the state to legislate morality, not to protect liberty. It demands respect and is dissatisfied with mere toleration. And it stirs people up where the liberal tradition tries to calm them down. It has upended our understanding of something as basic to human life as sex or gender, and in political initiatives like the 1619 Project, would make contempt for modern life a kind of virtue. If DEI and its pathologies are the unintended consequence of anti-discrimination radicalism, civil rights as interpreted by the left, then nothing is more urgent than a program of civil rights reform. Such a program is, in effect, what Donald Trump has launched in the first days of his second term. Though the connections between DEI and civil rights law are not immediately obvious, the presidential actions of 2025 are best understood as taking aim at vital pillars of the left's interpretation of the war on discrimination. Here is an experiment for social scientists. To what extent will the changes in civil rights law and politics, beginning with the Trump administration's 2025 policies, change democratic life, culture, ideas, mores, and social institutions? The next 30 or 40 years ought to provide lots of evidence for the battle among competing interpretations of wokeness. Is it a product of ideas or of civil rights law and politics? My money is on the latter. Part 1. DEI and Civil Rights Politics. Two objections to the above claims will be raised. First, is it really true that these early Trump policy reform pronouncements, even if implemented, will usher in a significant and lasting alteration of all of civil rights law and politics? Second, and more basically, why should we think that DEI dogma is the product of civil rights law and politics and not something else? Intellectual history, cultural Marxism, and so on. Addressing these questions will usefully illuminate our situation and prepare us to think about future developments. It makes sense to begin with the question of contemporary progressivism's relationship to civil rights politics. I have addressed this at greater length elsewhere, but one can summarize the whole in relatively brief terms with reference to two broad expansions of the civil rights regime advanced by the left, or two different aspects of progressive zeal that went well beyond anything in the original text of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The 1964 Act banned overt acts of discrimination by government in public gathering spaces, Title II, covering public accommodations, and in employment decisions like hiring, firing, and promotion, Title VII. Later developments went well beyond such measures, however. First, the 1964 Act emphatically did not embrace any kind of explicit group equality policy. In fact, it explicitly prohibited it. Second, nowhere did it ever contemplate anything approaching cultural indoctrination or other overt projects of social engineering. Reforms in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, led by the left but generally acceded to by the right, evident in a series of important Supreme Court opinions of these years, authored by conservative Supreme Court justices, exploded the original meaning of the law in both of those directions. Claims for tangible group equality in affirmative action and other policies, voting rights, and disparate impact aim to do something about persistent gaps in income, jobs, education, and so on between blacks and whites, women and men, and the like. Anti-discrimination law thus became a tool for large-scale redistribution of wealth and other tangible goods along group lines, what one of Trump's executive orders refers to as an identity-based spoils system. A second, more complicated set of practices and policies were cultural, involving civil rights policies designed to change what we say, how we think, and how we relate to one another in society and in the sexual arena. It is especially this side of the left's interpretation of the war on discrimination that has become so hated in today's populist upsurge. Outlining both of these dimensions of what the fight against discrimination became will prepare us to see how, in taking aim at the civil rights left's group redistribution program, as well as its cultural efforts, the Trump administration's reforms go to fundamentals. Group equality politics. Political exertions through law have always been central to the left's group equality and redistribution efforts. It's true that group redistribution measures exist outside of government, in many private sector practices, like the Democratic Party's delegate selection rules, for example. But any project to bring about group equality more broadly, public or private, is the kind of thing that cannot even be contemplated without assuming some forceful deployment of real political and legal muscle. This battle began as soon as the 1964 Act was passed. The quickest way to tell this somewhat long and complicated legal political story is with reference to 6 bundles of policies that transformed the civil rights revolution into a program of the group-based redistribution of wealth, jobs, and education. 3 of these sets of policies deal with affirmative action in employment. First, since 1965, the lure of federal government contracts has been used to support affirmative action for private businesses. Lyndon Johnson's Executive Order 11246, enforced by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Begun by Johnson, but perfected under Richard Nixon, this federal effort to induce large corporations to buy into affirmative action by reporting on the racial composition of their workforces and setting goals and timetables was a characteristically semi-official, semi-voluntary policy requirement that went beyond, and indeed contradicted, the text and spirit of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But it was upheld in 1971 and subsequently by the federal courts, and was never revoked until now by any Republican president. Promoting affirmative action by way of government contracts has likewise been supported by Congress in statutes and budgetary provisions using minority set-asides, supported by the offices of small and disadvantaged business utilization pervading the federal government. Second, since 1971, the federal government has itself been an affirmative action employer when the Civil Service Commission caved to pressure from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Nixon contributed here as well with EO 11478. Third, in 1979, the Supreme Court held that affirmative action in the private sphere does not fall afoul of the Constitution or civil rights law. These 3 policy steps are obscured to some degree by the role of the courts and the executive branch in making affirmative action a reality in American life. Most members of Congress also supported it, but they could never have passed an Affirmative Action Act without paying a heavy price at the polls. Though the text and basic principles of American civil rights law officially reject the idea of group redistribution in theory, it has long been entrenched in practice with the support of a more convoluted legal architecture. The 4th bundle of important affirmative action policies affects admissions in higher education, where state, public university policies have been the central players. A diversity loophole, created in the 1978 Baca case and affirmed in the 2003 Grotto decision, gave universities a green light to award preferential treatment to students from some minority racial and ethnic groups. This area of policy has already been dealt a decisive blow in the 2003 Supreme Court decision, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. Fifth, group equality measures in voting, so-called Max Black and Max Hispanic districts, have been entirely the creation of law. Finally, sixth, the notion of disparate impact discrimination, the idea that group inequalities are themselves evidence of illegal discrimination, has been a left-wing tool of civil rights enforcement to be wielded by government, no private right of action, since at least 1971. Under the 1964 Act's Title VI threat to cut funding, investigations by federal agencies applying a disparate impact standard extended the reach of this view of discrimination into many different areas of policy all at once. In recent years, equity has become the term used to denote such measures. That ideal was central to the Biden administration's, quote, whole of government equity agenda and its creation of agency equity teams in all of the agencies of the federal government. These efforts, and the debates about them, have been around since the very beginning. It might seem odd to say, therefore, that they are important to today's complaints about wokeness. But as we shall see, it is impossible to disentangle the more immediately hated cultural features of progressive doctrine built into civil rights law from the question of group equality. In any event, it is telling that nobody is saying now that attacks on affirmative action and disparate impact and the like are somehow beyond the remit of a campaign against DEI. One could say that Trump's two-pronged attack is schooling us all by mapping in rough outline the broad phenomenon underlying populist resentment. Cultural efforts imposed by law. The legal story behind the cultural features of contemporary progressivism is a bit more complicated, but not impossibly so. And it is important to clarify the legal political basis of this phenomenon, because most of the energy of populist anger and frustration resides here. The heart of this story is how employment discrimination law, Title VII of the 1964 Act, was reinterpreted in the 1980s and 1990s. The first step was the identification of something called hostile environment harassment. This concept, and especially sexual hostile environment harassment, radically transformed the anti-discrimination project. All at once, anti-discrimination enforcement became, of necessity, a matter of policing what we say and think, and how we treat one another in our interpersonal and social relations, which our liberal tradition had always kept separate from the state. This enlargement of the fight against discrimination was magnified again when employer liability for this newly identified and newly condemned set of social harms was expanded to an extraordinary degree. Employers became responsible not just for their own discrete discriminatory employment actions or policy decisions, but also for anything and everything that happened in the ballpark of harassment, including offensive statements, between employees and suppliers and contractors and customers in the workplace. Begging the courts for some safe harbor in this perilous new sea. Lawsuits in the millions, reputational harm. Employers were told that they would be granted some mercy if they could show that they had undertaken preventive and corrective measures, like diversity training, preventive, and firing miscreants, corrective. Though it is somewhat hidden, we can point here to a direct causal link between the law and progressive practices in the workplace. All of that had been put into place by 1998, when the Supreme Court announced its Ellis-Farragut employment liability test. Naturally, this framework was embraced by employers. They went along with it, quote-unquote, voluntarily, but they were incentivized to do so by a legal scheme that no one in 1964 could have foreseen. Employers then became the privatized enforcers of anti-discrimination policing that obliterated the public-private divide. Envisioning new possibilities of, quote, institutional citizenship, academics describe a brave new world shaped by, quote, the legalization of the workplace and, quote, the managerialization of law. The immediate and direct result of this legal order was a regime of hypersensitivity, pedantic moralizing, and censorship, a program of invasive micro-policing of daily life and of our interpersonal relations. This was all enforced by our fellow citizens with draconian sanctions, above all loss of employment, and no recourse to due process. It is this poisonous brew that is widely despised today as wokeness. When people disparage DEI today, they generally mean the welter of rules, practices, institutions, and personnel, officers, called into being to carry out this new political program of cultural and social engineering. The most visible incarnations of DEI are to be found in DEI training and in DEI offices and officers. But this is just the tip of a large iceberg. Offices of equal opportunity and myriad other institutions, diversity task forces, bias incident response teams, workplace responsibility committees, equity teams, and so on, work under the supervision of the newly necessary agents of the new order. Equal opportunity officers, Title IX officers, the ubiquitous Chief Diversity Officer. These individuals and bodies are charged with undertaking a wide range of tasks, including formulating and publicizing internal policies, assessing the status or climate of the institution and those operating within it, monitoring bias reporting systems, fielding discrimination and harassment claims, conducting investigations, keeping records, and meting out consequences. Though they have been put in place by the semi-voluntary workings of employment discrimination enforcement, they have quasi-official status, authority, and weight. Non-compliance at any step may be cause for corrective firing and other punitive/disciplinary actions. A parallel legal order in the world of education borrowed from these developments in employment law to impose a similar regime in our colleges and universities. Its enforcement machinery is distinguishable only because it is more aggressive, since anti-discrimination law affects higher education twice, employment discrimination law on one hand, and myriad civil rights educational regulations, Title IX, accreditation standards, etc., on the other. Once you start to look for it, it is actually fairly easy to show how civil rights law inserted progressive dogma into all of our institutions of employment and education, making it a pervasive and powerful force. These legal political beginnings have shaped other democratic social structures, the long march through the institutions, and poisoned the modern democratic soul, shaping individuals and their moral outlook and mental categories. This is what Aristotle meant when he wrote that politics is architectonic. Citizens look up to the law. They respect its authority and fear its sanctions. They generally feel incapable in their weakness of resisting it. Seeing the victory of a broad and revered political development and hearing its moral claims repeated everywhere, the new logic of identity, inclusion, recognition, respect, equity, and so on, many people come to think its demands define justice. Politics is causally powerful because most people are decent citizens who wish on some level to do what is right. That might sound naive and moralistic. It is meant only to be a statement of fact. This is why many Americans, good citizens affected by this most powerful democratic, moral, political, legal juggernaut of the 20th century, became living proof of the power of the anti-discrimination regime, as interpreted by those who had pushed its logic and lessons the farthest. From wokeness to anti-wokeness. But not all Americans, or not all of them, all of the way, or all of the time. The American soul is in fact deeply divided on these questions. That is the most important meaning of anti-woke anger and concern. Wokeness produced anti-wokeness in two different ways. Two large obstacles have always stood in the way of the left's anti-discrimination radicalism, and in the past few years, they have asserted themselves in ever more pronounced ways. First, civil rights extremism has exposed the lingering hold of our liberal democratic constitutional order. A people raised under the principles, politics, and institutions of the Enlightenment has not entirely forgotten its devotion to the cause of liberty. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, due process, the idea that legislating morality is wrong. All these ideas and more have been called back into service to help combat political extremism. This is why attacks on liberalism by post-liberal authors like Patrick Deneen could not be more misguided. Second, members of groups identified as the past perpetrators of discrimination, whites, men, straights, Christians, what the law calls majority groups, have become frustrated with a world that condemns them and their past, and that can find nothing to admire in their heroes or history, the 1619 Project, statue removals, and so on. It is the members of these groups whose jobs, wealth, educational opportunities, and other benefits must be sacrificed if group redistribution is to be effected. These majority groups have long felt that enough is enough, but books by authors like Jeremy Carl are now starting to say so without embarrassment. Anti-wokeness therefore represents a protest by something like a majority of our democratic population in the name of the political tradition that has defined our public life for more than 2 centuries, and in the name of their perceived economic and cultural self-interest. As inchoate as complaints about wokeness may sometimes be, they represent extremely powerful political forces in the aggregate.